Jerry, quand on parle des meilleures pratiques pour...
When we talk about best practices, Jerry, for the implementation of this convention so that all the rights of the child will be respected, what would be the best practices according to you?
Well, just as a segue into answering that question and to respond a little bit to what was last said here, the whole notion of how does our culture value and where does it position the child's best interests. British Columbia conducted a 7 or 8 year process to rewrite its family law legislation, the legislation that governs separation and divorce. And it looked very hard at the question of children's best interests. And the foundation of our perspective was that, well, the old statute said that in decisions involving the child's best interests are the paramount consideration, quote unquote. And we had difficulty seeing, in fact, how that language actually made a difference. And so in 2013, new legislation was passed, and the language of the new legislation says that in such decisions, the only consideration is the best interest of the child, which from a legal perspective was a little bit controversial because it signaled a significant ramping up, or relatively significant ramping up of the weight to be given to that criteria. Now, 2013 until 2017 is, in matters legal, not a very long time to allow a statutory provision to evolve and be interpreted and so on, but people are keeping a very close eye on it to see what's happening or what's going to happen, and it doesn't appear that the change in the language has actually made that significant an impact yet on practice on the ground. So it is problematic. In terms of best practices to overcome these multiple barriers that we've been talking about, again, I take a sort of a procedural perspective on this, and my thinking again goes to the value of informal and collaborative processes. When I did litigation involving families and children, my encounters with children as a lawyer, I was always a lawyer for parents, but my exposure to the children was absolutely minimal. When I started doing mediation, I started to have many more opportunities to actually engage children directly or indirectly in the mediation, even sometimes as indirectly as having the parents put a picture of the kids on the table while we went on. And I loved that flexibility, and I loved the freedom and the scope of informal processes. So we tend to think of enforcement of children's rights very often in formal legal settings, but part of my interest here is to say that I think in informal settings there's often, practically speaking, a much stronger ability to actually enforce the child's best interests. The other thing that comes to bear on this is that the legal system kind of officially, if you have two parents before the court in a family law matter, the assumption is that between the two parents and the judge, they will take care of the child's best interest. The child's best interest will be protected. And that is, as I was suggesting earlier, just frankly, very inaccurate. Because parents don't tend to. Financial considerations, emotional considerations, practical considerations often prevent that from happening. I've mentioned the child participating in the process. There are a growing number of mechanisms, a growing sensitivity, as I perceive it, in the justice system to the importance of the child being heard in decisions that affect that child. And there's a lot of study and policy development going on right now in British Columbia. I don't know about other jurisdictions, to sort of say how far can we go in actually bringing children into mediation processes? How do we assess capacity and safety in circumstances for people to do that? My last comment in terms of best practices to overcome these barriers steps back a little bit to what Christian was commenting on earlier. Sometimes I think existing legal tools are just insufficient, and I think that the answer to some of these problems becomes political. And I think that it's a question of we have to bring the appropriate political power to bear to establish the kind of regimes that are needed in order to effectively enforce children's rights.
Et quand on parle du meilleur intérêt de l'enfant,
But when we talk about the best interest of the child, maybe we forget the 40 other rights that exist in the convention. You talked, Samira, about the totality of the rights, and in the foundation we decided to put 7 principles to regroup them, because we often talk about protection and there are many articles to that effect. Then there is the right of the family, the civil rights, then rights to health. So there are 7 basic principles, and we can probably put all of the articles within those 7 principles. So when we look at the case of Jack that Dr. Blair mentioned, we don't have laws necessarily. For example, the child has a right to go to school, but maybe the resources aren't there to deal with his problems, and so the system drops the child and doesn't really protect the child. So we have all these rights, but we don't necessarily protect the child. What should we do?
I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question that we would all love to have the easy and simple answer to, but the fact of the matter is that there is no easy answer, and that's, I think, why we are still struggling with it. But I do really think that when it comes to dollar allocations, when it comes to the way that our legislations are built, there are issues of accountability that are there from start to finish. In Ontario, there are, at least within the education context, some avenues of recourse for children and or families who are seeing their children excluded or kicked out of school or treated in a way that's inappropriate. But the pushback that using those tools for that young person, the actual pushback that how dare you try and challenge me for making this decision is a big issue. And that speaks again to this cultural shift that needs to occur in the sense that, having processes of accountability isn't a bad thing. And it doesn't have to necessarily even be an adversarial thing. It has to be a solution-focused system where there can be measures of accountability, where the relationships are still maintained in that process, because specifically for children, again, in an education context, they're in school from 5 to 18 or to 21 if we're looking at a child with a disability, or even longer. And we want the child to have as many structures of support in their life as possible. And the school is one of those primary institutions for a child to receive support and to be able to reach their maximum potential. And so, certainly that shift is a big part of that. And I also think that when it comes to the best practices, we need to make sure that all of the people who are responsible for looking at how they can create better accountability within their own structures are given the resources and space to do it, because we do see that there are lots of good intentioned educators who want to do more, but they're again not getting the resources in order to try and get there.
Est-ce que